Hello, and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine walking through a vast, silent plain in the damp pre-dawn of the Cambodian jungle. Around you, half-submerged stone causeways stretch into morning mist. Moss-covered temple walls rise barely above encroaching forest. Water reflects broken spires in twilight. This is Angkor Wat, the heart of what was once one of the greatest civilizations on Earth. The jungle emperors of Angkor commanded a hydraulic city nearly the size of modern Los Angeles. They were master engineers of water and stone, builders of temples that still pierce the sky after 8 centuries. Their empire stretched across much of Southeast Asia, sustained by an intricate network of canals, reservoirs and waterways that fed millions of people. And then, gradually, mysteriously, this colossal civilization faded into green silence. How could such sophisticated watermasters, who had tamed monsoons and rivers for centuries, simply vanish into the jungle? What really happened to the jungle emperors of Angkor Wat? What forces could unravel an empire built on stone and water? But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. To understand what happened to the jungle emperors of Angkor, we must first walk through the world they inherited. Long before the first canal was dug or the first stone temple rose from the earth, this land belonged to the rhythm of water and weather, to the ancient dance between monsoon and drought that had shaped these plains for countless millennia. Picture yourself standing in the heart of what would one day become the greatest hydraulic civilization in Southeast Asia. It is perhaps the 8th century of the Common Era, and you find yourself in a landscape that seems almost impossibly flat. You're positioned on the vast alluvial plain that stretches between the gentle Kulin Hills to the north and the great freshwater sea of Tonle Sap to the south. This is not the dramatic geography of mountain passes or coastal cliffs, but something far more subtle and, in its own way, far more powerful. This is a world shaped entirely by water. The earth beneath your feet tells the story of centuries upon centuries of patient deposition. Rivers flowing down from the distant mountains have carried sediment grain by grain, season by season, building this remarkably level plain that extends for hundreds of square miles in every direction. The soil is rich, dark, and deep, pregnant with nutrients that have travelled from highland forests and distant watersheds. When you scoop up a handful of this earth, it feels heavy and fertile between your fingers, still damp from the morning dew or the previous night's rain. Above you, the sky holds the promise and threat that defines all life in this region. During the dry months from November through April, the heavens remain a brilliant cloudless blue that stretches unbroken from horizon to horizon. The sun beats down with increasing intensity as the dry season progresses, baking the earth until it cracks in geometric patterns that run like a vast puzzle across the landscape. Springs and smaller streams begin to dwindle, their waters retreating toward their source, leaving behind channels filled with nothing but dry leaves and the tracks of animals seeking the remaining pools. But then comes the transformation. As surely as the earth turns, the great atmospheric engine of the monsoon begins to stir. You can feel it first as a change in the quality of the air itself. The humidity begins to rise, creating a thick, almost breathable atmosphere that clings to your skin. Clouds gather on the horizon, towering cumulus formations that build throughout the day like enormous white mountains climbing toward heaven. The wind shifts, carrying with it the scent of rain from across the great expanse of the South China Sea. When the monsoon finally arrives, it does so with a completeness that transforms everything. The rain does not merely fall, it descends in sheets, in walls of water that can reduce visibility to mere yards. You can hear it approaching across the plain, a sound like distant applause that grows to a roar as the storm front passes over you. Within hours, the cracked and dusty earth becomes a muddy sea. Water spreads across the landscape, finding every depression, every subtle fold in the terrain, turning the entire region into a vast network of temporary lakes and streams. This is when the land reveals its true character. What appeared to be solid ground during the dry season now shows itself to be an intricate topography of slight rises and gentle depressions. Water finds its level with mathematical precision, pooling in areas that may be only inches lower than their surroundings. Suddenly, you can see the invisible architecture of the landscape, the way water naturally wants to flow, the channels it carves for itself, the areas where it prefers to collect and rest. The Siem Reap River winds through this transformed world like a lazy serpent, its course shifting subtly from year to year as floods deposit new sediment and carve new channels. During the height of the wet season, this river swells far beyond its dry season banks, spreading across the floodplain in broad sheets of slow-moving water that reflect the sky like enormous mirrors. Other smaller waterways join this liquid network, streams with names lost to history that rise and fall with the seasonal pulse of rainfall, carrying their own loads of sediment and organic matter. To the south lies Tonle Sap, that remarkable body of water that expands and contracts like the breathing of some vast sleeping creature. During the dry season, the lake covers perhaps 1,000 square miles. But as the monsoon, waters accumulate and the Mekong River far to the south reaches its peak flow, something extraordinary happens. The physics of water flow actually reverses the direction of the Tonle Sap River, causing the lake to expand to nearly 4 times its dry season size. The flooded forest that surrounds the lake during these months becomes a nursery for countless species of fish, a floating world of submerged trees and drifting vegetation. In this seasonal world of flood and drought, the earliest human inhabitants learned to read the subtle signs that spelled survival or disaster. Small communities clustered on slightly elevated ground, those barely perceptible rises that meant the difference between staying dry and being submerged. They built their homes on stilts and learned to navigate by boat during the flood months, to fish in the temporary lakes, and to plant their rice in precise synchronization with the water's rhythm. These were people who understood intimately that water was both blessing and curse, the foundation of life and the potential agent of destruction. They learned to harvest the bounty of the flooded forests, to catch fish in quantities that could sustain them through the dry months, and to read the landscape with an accuracy that allowed them to predict where water would flow, where it would collect, and where it would retreat. This was the world that awaited transformation, a landscape already shaped by water but not yet controlled by human will. It was a place of tremendous potential, where the annual gift of monsoon rain and fertile silt created conditions that could support vast populations if only someone could learn to harness and direct the natural rhythms that governed everything. The stage was set for one of humanity's most ambitious experiments in environmental engineering. In this world of seasonal abundance and scarcity, where water determined the rhythm of all life, it was perhaps inevitable that human ambition would eventually turn toward the ultimate prize, the ability to control the very forces that made survival possible. The story of how scattered villages became a mighty empire begins not with conquest or treasure, but with the patient dream of mastering water itself. Across the Great Plain, small communities had learned to thrive within the natural cycles of flood and drought. Each settlement occupied its own carefully chosen piece of higher ground, its own relationship with the seasonal rivers and temporary lakes. These were not isolated outposts, but part of a growing web of connection and exchange. Traders moved between villages during the dry season, following paths that would become waterways during the rains. Fishermen shared knowledge of the changing channels and the best locations for seasonal catches. Farmers exchanged seeds and techniques, learning which varieties of rice performed best in different types of flood conditions. But this network of small-scale survival, however ingenious, remained forever, vulnerable to the whims of weather and water. A year of insufficient rain could mean hunger. An unexpectedly severe flood could destroy months of careful preparation. The communities that thrived were those that could read the landscape most accurately and respond most quickly to its changes, but even the wisest remained subject to forces beyond their control. It was in this context of both opportunity and vulnerability that a new kind of leadership began to emerge. These were not simply war chiefs or village elders, but individuals who understood that true power lay not in commanding people, but in commanding water. They recognized that whoever could promise reliable irrigation during the dry months, whoever could protect against devastating floods during the wet season, whoever could expand the areas of productive agriculture beyond what nature provided unassisted, such a leader could offer something that no amount of military might could match: security itself. The earliest experiments in water control were modest affairs, barely distinguishable from the natural landscape. A small earthen dam built across a seasonal stream to create a reservoir that might last through the first months of the dry season. a canal dug to divert water from a river's natural course toward fields that would otherwise remain unplanted. These projects required not just vision but coordination, the ability to organize labor from multiple villages, to convince people to work for months on structures that might benefit everyone but belong to no one. Success in these early hydraulic ventures created a new kind of authority. The leader who could successfully organize the construction and maintenance of irrigation works, who could negotiate water rights between communities, who could predict the optimal timing for planting and harvesting based on careful observation of water levels and weather patterns. Such a leader possessed a form of legitimacy that went far beyond traditional sources of power. They became essential not just for prosperity, but for survival itself. As these small-scale water projects proved their worth, ambition naturally expanded. Why stop with a single reservoir when a larger one could serve more villages? Why accept the limitations of seasonal streams when the main rivers carried water year-round? Why remain content with small improvements when the landscape itself seemed to invite transformation on a grander scale? The logic of hydraulic power, once begun, created its own momentum toward ever greater scale and complexity. Into this world of growing hydraulic ambition stepped a figure whose vision would reshape not just the landscape, but the very nature of kingship in Southeast Asia. In the early years of the 9th century, a prince named Jayavarman emerged from the complex web of competing polities that had developed across the region. But Jayavarman II, as history would remember him, understood something that his rivals had not yet grasped: that in this water-dominated landscape, political power and hydraulic mastery were not merely connected, but were, in fact, the same thing. In the year 802, on the sacred mountain of Kulen that rose from the northern edge of the Great Plain, Jayavarman declared himself not merely a king, but a god-king, a Devaraja whose divine nature gave him unique authority over the forces of nature itself. This was not simply religious theatre, though the rituals and symbolism were elaborate and carefully constructed. It was a practical claim with profound implications. Only a divine ruler could legitimately command the waters upon which all life depended. The ceremony that established Jayavarman as the first emperor of what would become the Khmer Empire was held at a location that perfectly embodied his hydraulic vision. Mount Kulen was not just symbolically elevated, it was the source of the rivers that fed the Great Plain below. By establishing his sacred authority at the headwaters, Jayavarman was making a claim that extended downstream to every village, every field, every person whose life depended on the flow of water from this highland source. From this elevated beginning, Jayavarman set in motion the unification of the scattered polities of the region under a single hydraulic vision. This was not conquest in the traditional sense, though military force certainly played a role. Rather, it was the gradual creation of a new kind of state, one whose legitimacy rested on its ability to coordinate water management across vast distances and diverse communities. The early projects undertaken during Jayavarman's reign established the template for all that would follow. Small reservoirs were enlarged and connected. Canals were dug to redirect seasonal streams toward areas of expanding settlement. Most importantly, a systematic approach to maintenance was established, recognizing that hydraulic infrastructure required constant attention and renewal. Silt had to be dredged from canals. Embankments had to be reinforced after each flood season. The timing of water release from reservoirs had to be carefully coordinated with planting cycles across multiple communities. This maintenance imperative created a new relationship between ruler and subject. The king's legitimacy came to depend not on his ability to conquer enemies or accumulate treasure, but on his success in keeping the water flowing. The elaborate rituals and monuments that would later become the most visible legacy of the Khmer Empire all served to reinforce this fundamental compact. The king would maintain the waters, and the waters would sustain the kingdom. The vision of hydraulic mastery that Jayavarman had proclaimed from the sacred heights of Mount Kulen could only be realized through the patient accumulation of earthwork and stone, season after season, year after year. What followed his declaration of divine kingship was not the sudden appearance of a completed water empire, but rather the methodical construction of the infrastructure that would make such an empire possible. This was the unglamorous but essential work of empire building: the digging of earth, the shaping of channels, the careful observation of water's behaviour across the vast canvas of the Cambodian plain. Imagine yourself as one of the engineers tasked with translating royal vision into hydraulic reality. You stand at the edge of what will become a great reservoir, but for now it is simply a depression in the landscape, a place where water naturally collects during the rainy season but drains away as the dry months progress. Your challenge is to see not what is, but what could be. How this natural basin might be enlarged and deepened, how its edges might be reinforced with earthen embankments, how channels might be cut to bring water in during times of plenty and release it during times of need. The work begins with the most fundamental of human tools, the basket and the digging stick, the simple technology that has moved Earth since the beginning of agriculture. But the scale of the undertaking requires organisation that goes far beyond what any single village has ever attempted. Thousands of workers must be coordinated, their efforts synchronised across vast distances and extended periods of time. The timing of the work must be carefully planned around the agricultural calendar, for these same workers are needed in the fields during planting and harvest seasons. You watch as the great excavation takes shape, handful by handful, basket load by basket load. The earth that is removed does not simply disappear, it becomes the raw material for the embankments that will contain the future reservoir. Every basketful of soil dug from the centre is carried to the edges, where it is carefully placed and compacted to form the walls that will hold back the accumulated waters. The mathematics of this exchange are precise and unforgiving. The volume of earth removed from the basin must equal the volume of earth built up in the embankments, with allowances made for settling and erosion. The construction reveals the subtle complexities of working with water. The bottom of the reservoir must be shaped not as a simple bowl, but with gentle gradations that will allow water to flow toward the intake channels even when the water level is low. The embankments must be built with cores of clay that will resist seepage, but faced with more permeable materials that will not crack under the alternating expansion and contraction of wet and dry seasons. Most critically, the spillways and control structures must be positioned and constructed with mathematical precision, for these will determine how the reservoir fills and empties, how it responds to both drought and flood. As the months pass, you begin to see how this single project fits into a larger network of water management that is taking shape across the plain. Canals are being dug to connect this reservoir to others, creating a system that can move water across great distances from areas of surplus to areas of need. Some of these channels follow the natural contours of the land, taking advantage of existing streams and seasonal watercourses. Others cut across the grain of the landscape, requiring careful calculation of gradients and the construction of bridges and aqueducts where they must cross other waterways. The engineering challenges are matched by equally complex problems of social organisation. The labour force required for these projects cannot be sustained through coercion alone. It must be motivated by a shared understanding of the benefits that will result from all this effort. Workers must be fed during the construction season, housed in temporary settlements near the work sites, and organised into teams that can work efficiently together. Specialists must be trained in the arts of surveying, hydraulic engineering, and construction management. The entire system of accounting must be developed to track the allocation of labour, materials, and food supplies. Most remarkably, this vast undertaking must be accomplished without the benefit of written records or detailed technical manuals. The knowledge of how to build and maintain hydraulic infrastructure exists primarily in the minds of experienced engineers and foremen, passed down through apprenticeship and demonstration. The techniques for measuring water flow, calculating proper gradients, and predicting the behaviour of earthen embankments under different conditions are all part of an oral tradition that must be carefully preserved and transmitted from generation to generation. The seasonal rhythm of construction becomes as regular and predictable as the monsoon itself. During the dry months, when agricultural demands are minimal and movement across the landscape is easy, the great projects advance rapidly. Teams of workers spread across multiple construction sites, following plans that exist not on paper, but in the minds of the master engineers who direct their efforts. Earth is moved, channels are deepened, embankments rise higher and stronger. The sound of thousands of workers digging, carrying, and building creates a constant background hum across the plain. When the rains return, construction slows but does not stop entirely. This is when the first tests of the emerging infrastructure take place. Water begins to flow through the newly completed channels, revealing flaws in design or construction that must be corrected. Embankments settle under the weight of accumulated water, requiring additional reinforcement. The complex interactions between different parts of the system become apparent as water finds its way through the network of canals and reservoirs, sometimes behaving exactly as predicted, sometimes revealing the need for adjustments and modifications. With each passing year, the scale and sophistication of the projects increase. What began as modest improvements to natural watercourses evolves into an ambitious program of landscape transformation. The boundaries between natural and artificial become increasingly blurred as human engineering works with and modifies the existing hydrology of the region. The Great Plain begins to take on a new character, one that reflects not just the rhythms of nature, but the growing power and ambition of human design. The patient accumulation of hydraulic mastery that had occupied the first generations of Khmer engineers was about to bear fruit on a scale that would have seemed impossible to those early builders digging their first modest canals. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the water empire that had begun as Jayavarman's vision had matured into something far grander than even its founders might have imagined. The infrastructure of reservoirs, canals, and embankments had reached a critical threshold where it could support not just survival, but spectacular expansion and monumental ambition. Picture yourself standing on one of the great causeways that now stretched across the transformed landscape. The road beneath your feet is raised above the surrounding plain on a foundation of carefully laid stone, allowing travellers to move freely even during the height of the flood season. To either side, the view reveals a world that bears little resemblance to the seasonal marshlands and scattered villages of earlier centuries. Instead, you see a vast network of geometric precision. Rectangular fields bounded by low embankments, straight canals cutting across the natural contours of the land, reservoirs that stretch to the horizon like inland seas. This is the hydraulic city at its moment of greatest achievement, a human-engineered landscape that covers nearly 1,000 square miles. The scale is difficult to comprehend from ground level, but imagine viewing it from the height of a soaring bird, and you would see something unprecedented in the medieval world. An urban area larger than many modern cities, but one organised around the flow of water rather than the movement of vehicles or the clustering of buildings around central markets. The population that this system could support was equally unprecedented. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 1 million people lived within the boundaries of Greater Angkor during its peak centuries, making it one of the largest urban concentrations anywhere in the world at that time. But these were not people crammed into tenements or huddled within defensive walls. Instead, they were distributed across a vast suburban landscape of wooden houses, temple complexes, and productive gardens, all sustained by the reliable flow of water through the carefully maintained canal system. The wealth generated by this agricultural abundance allowed the Khmer rulers to pursue territorial expansion on an extraordinary scale. Their armies moved outward from the hydraulic heartland in all directions, establishing control over much of what we now know as Thailand, Laos, southern Vietnam, and parts of Myanmar. These were not merely raiding expeditions or temporary conquests, but the systematic incorporation of vast territories into a tributary system centered on Angkor. Local rulers throughout mainland Southeast Asia found themselves compelled to acknowledge Khmer supremacy and to send regular tribute to the god kings who commanded the Great Water Empire. But it was not military conquest alone that marked this golden age. The most enduring legacy of Khmer expansion was architectural, the construction of temple complexes that still rank among the most magnificent religious monuments ever created. These were not simply buildings, but entire sacred landscapes that embodied the cosmological vision of their builders. The temple mountains that rose from the engineered plain represented Mount Meru, the cosmic center of Hindu and Buddhist universe, while the moats and canals that surrounded them symbolized the cosmic oceans that encircled the world. The construction of these monuments required resources and organizational capabilities that could only have been sustained by the agricultural surplus generated through hydraulic mastery. Consider the logistics of building just one of the great temple complexes. Hundreds of thousands of sandstone blocks had to be quarried from distant mountains, transported by river and canal to the construction sites, then lifted into place with mathematical precision. Thousands of skilled craftsmen had to be trained in the arts of stone carving, architectural design, and engineering. Vast quantities of food had to be provided to sustain the workforce, and this food could only be grown through the intensive rice agriculture that the canal system made possible. The Temple of Angkor Wat itself, begun in the early 12th century, represents the culmination of this tradition of monumental construction. The scale of the undertaking staggers the imagination. A temple complex covering more than 400 acres, surrounded by a moat nearly 4 miles in circumference, rising to a central tower that stands more than 200 feet above the surrounding plain. The precision of its construction rivals that of any building in the medieval world, with stone blocks fitted together so perfectly that mortar was often unnecessary, and with astronomical alignments calculated to exactitudes that demonstrate sophisticated mathematical knowledge. Yet Angkor Wat was only the largest and most famous of dozens of major temple complexes constructed during the golden age of the Khmer Empire. Each represented not just an individual project, but part of a comprehensive program of landscape modification that integrated religious architecture with hydraulic engineering. The temples were not isolated monuments but integral parts of the water management system, with their moats and reservoirs serving practical as well as symbolic functions. The artistic achievement of these monuments was equally remarkable. Miles of bas-relief carvings covered the walls of the temples, depicting scenes from Hindu epics and Buddhist texts, as well as detailed representations of daily life in the Khmer Empire. These carvings provide us with invaluable insights into how the people of Angkor lived, worked, and organized their society. We see farmers working in flooded rice fields, fishermen casting their nets in temple moats, merchants travelling along the great causeways, and nobles enjoying the luxuries that their empire's wealth made possible. The integration of water management and religious architecture created a sacred landscape, unlike anything that had existed before. Pilgrims approaching the great temples would journey for miles through an environment that had been entirely transformed by human engineering, yet which maintained a profound connection to the natural rhythms of monsoon and drought that governed all life in the region. The canals that carried them toward their spiritual destinations were the same waterways that irrigated the rice fields and filled the city's reservoirs. The magnificent temples that dominated the skyline of Angkor were only the visible expression of something far more remarkable, an invisible city of water that flowed beneath and around the stone monuments, sustaining the entire civilization through an intricate network of channels, reservoirs, and control structures. To understand the true genius of the Khmer Empire, you must learn to see this hidden landscape, to follow the quiet paths of water as it moved through the engineered environment that made everything else possible. Imagine yourself walking along one of the great embankments that contained the West Baray, the largest of Angkor's reservoirs. Stretching for nearly 5 miles in length and more than a mile in width, this artificial lake held enough water to irrigate tens of thousands of acres of rice fields during the dry season. But as you stroll along its grassy banks in the early morning, breathing the cool air that rises from its vast surface, you're witnessing only one component of a water management system of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. The water that filled this reservoir came from multiple sources, each carefully integrated into the overall hydraulic design. During the monsoon months, channels diverted flow from the Siem Reap River and other seasonal streams, capturing the abundant rainfall that would otherwise flow uselessly toward the distant sea. But the engineers of Angkor understood that surface water alone could not provide the reliability that their expanding civilization required. They also tapped into groundwater sources, carefully positioning their reservoirs to take advantage of natural aquifers that could supplement surface flows during dry periods. Perhaps most ingeniously, they learned to harness the seasonal reversal of the Tonle Sap, that remarkable phenomenon where the Great Lake expanded and contracted with the rhythms of the distant Mekong River. When the lake was at its highest levels during the late monsoon season, channels carried this surplus water northward toward the reservoir system around Angkor. When the lake retreated to its dry season minimum, the flow reversed, carrying irrigation water southward to support agriculture in the areas closest to the lake. Walk with me now along one of the main canals that carried water from the reservoirs toward the agricultural zones that surrounded the temple complexes. The channel beside you is perhaps 30 feet wide and carefully graded to maintain a gentle but consistent flow. The banks are reinforced with carefully fitted stones that prevent erosion while allowing controlled seepage to water the gardens and orchards that line the waterway. Every few hundred yards, smaller channels branch off from the main canal, carrying water through an intricate network of distribution channels that could direct flow with remarkable precision to specific areas of cultivation. The mathematics of this system were complex beyond anything that had been attempted before in the region. The engineers had to calculate not just the volume of water needed for irrigation, but also the timing of its delivery, the maintenance of proper water levels in the reservoirs, and the prevention of both flooding and drought. They developed sophisticated techniques for measuring flow rates, adjusting channel gradients, and coordinating the operation of multiple reservoirs across vast distances. You can feel the engineering sophistication in the gentle current that moves past your feet as you wade into one of the smaller distribution channels. The water moves with deliberate purpose, neither rushing nor stagnating, but flowing at exactly the rate required to carry the life-sustaining moisture to distant rice fields without causing erosion or overflow. The bed of the channel has been carefully shaped and lined with materials chosen for their ability to resist scouring during high flows while preventing excessive seepage during low water periods. The seasonal rhythm of the water system created a complex choreography of agricultural activity across the entire Angkor region. During the early months of the dry season, when the monsoon rains had ended but the reservoirs were still full, water flowed freely through the canal network, allowing farmers to plant and nurture their dry season rice crops. As the months progressed and water levels in the reservoirs began to drop, the flow through individual channels was carefully regulated through an elaborate system of gates, weirs, and control structures. These control mechanisms were marvels of hydraulic engineering in their own right. Imagine examining one of the stone sluice gates that regulated flow between different sections of the canal network. The stonework is precisely cut and fitted, with channels carved to exact specifications that would allow water to flow at predetermined rates. The gates themselves could be raised or lowered using wooden beams and rope systems, allowing operators to fine-tune the distribution of water with remarkable precision. The maintenance of this vast hydraulic infrastructure required constant attention and sophisticated organization. Teams of workers moved continuously through the canal network, clearing vegetation from channels, repairing erosion damage to embankments, and adjusting control structures to optimize flow patterns. During the dry season, when water levels were low, major maintenance projects could be undertaken, channels could be deepened, stone lining could be repaired or replaced, and new distribution networks could be constructed. The social implications of this water management system were profound. Control over water meant control over agricultural production, which in turn determined the prosperity and survival of entire communities. The operators of the canal system possessed technical knowledge that was essential to the functioning of the entire civilization, making them powerful figures in the complex hierarchy of Angkor society. The timing of planting and harvesting across thousands of square miles had to be coordinated with the availability of irrigation water, creating dependencies and relationships that bound the entire region together in a web of hydraulic interdependence. As you stand beside one of the great canals in the soft light of evening, listening to the quiet sound of water moving through the channel, you're witnessing the true foundation of Khmer civilization. This gentle flow sustained the population that built the temples, supported the armies that conquered distant lands, and generated the wealth that made possible the artistic and architectural achievements that we remember today. The magnificent infrastructure of canals and reservoirs that we have explored was not built for its own sake, but to sustain a way of life that depended entirely upon the reliable flow of water through the engineered landscape of Angkor. To truly understand this civilization at its height, you must step away from the grand temples and walk among the people whose daily routines were shaped by the seasonal rhythms of irrigation and agriculture, whose prosperity and security depended upon the continued functioning of the hydraulic systems that surrounded them. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in one of the countless wooden houses that dotted the suburban landscape around the great temple complexes. Your home stands on stilts, raised above the level of seasonal flooding, with walls of woven bamboo and a roof thatched with palm leaves. As you step outside into the cool morning air, you can hear the gentle sound of water moving through the nearby canal, a constant background music that accompanies all daily activity in this water-centered world. The rhythm of your day, like that of everyone around you, is determined by the agricultural calendar that governs life throughout the Angkor region. If it is the beginning of the wet season, you join the thousands of farmers who wade into the flooded rice fields to transplant the young seedlings that have been carefully nurtured in special nursery plots. The work is methodical and meditative. You bend low over the muddy water, your hands moving in practiced patterns as you set each delicate green shoot into the soft earth beneath the surface. The flooded fields stretch away from you in all directions, creating a landscape that shimmers like a vast mirror broken only by the scattered palms and fruit trees that mark the boundaries between different family holdings. Other farmers work in parallel lines across the fields, and you can hear the soft splash of their movements and the quiet conversations that help pass the hours of labour. This is communal work that requires coordination and cooperation, for the timing of transplanting must be synchronised across entire watersheds to make optimal use of the available irrigation water. As the rice plants grow and mature over the following months, your attention turns to the careful management of water levels in the fields. Too little water, and the young plants will wither in the harsh tropical sun. Too much, and they may rot or be washed away by excessive currents. You work with your neighbours to adjust the small earthen dikes that control water flow between individual fields, opening channels to allow fresh water to circulate when needed, closing them to conserve moisture during drier periods. The irrigation water that nourishes your crops comes to you through an elaborate network of channels and distribution points that connect your individual fields to the great reservoirs and canals that define the regional water system. You may not fully understand the engineering principles that govern this vast hydraulic machine, but you have learned through experience exactly when and how to manipulate the simple wooden gates and earthen barriers that control water flow at the local level. During the dry season, when the rains have ended and the reservoirs provide the only source of irrigation water, your daily routine includes careful monitoring of water levels and flow rates. You rise early to check the channels that supply your fields, noting any changes in the volume or clarity of the water that might signal problems upstream. If necessary, you join work parties, organised to clear blockages from canals, repair damage to embankments, or adjust the operation of control structures that regulate water distribution across the local irrigation network. The abundance of food produced by this intensive agricultural system supports not only the farmers who work directly in the fields, but also a complex urban economy centred around the great temple complexes. As you travel along the raised causeways that connect different parts of the Angkor region, you encounter a bustling world of specialised craftsmanship and trade that would be impossible without the agricultural surplus generated by irrigated rice cultivation. In the workshops clustered around the temples, skilled artisans spend their days carving the intricate stone reliefs that decorate the walls of the religious monuments. These craftsmen have been freed from the necessity of producing their own food by the reliability of the agricultural system that surrounds them. Instead, they can devote themselves entirely to the creation of art, developing techniques and aesthetic traditions that represent some of the finest achievements of medieval sculpture. The stone carvers work in teams, with master craftsmen designing the overall compositions, while apprentices execute the detailed carving under careful supervision. The sound of chisels against stone creates a constant rhythmic background as these artists slowly transform blank sandstone surfaces into elaborate narrative scenes, depicting episodes from Hindu and Buddhist mythology, as well as detailed representations of daily life in the Khmer Empire. Nearby, other specialists pursue their own trades: metalworkers who create bronze sculptures and ceremonial objects, textile workers who weave silk and cotton fabrics, using techniques and patterns that reflect influences from across the trading networks of Southeast Asia, potters who produce both utilitarian ceramics for daily use and elaborate ritual vessels for temple ceremonies. The economic relationships that bind all these activities together are as complex as the hydraulic systems that make them possible. Rice from the irrigated fields feeds the urban population of craftsmen, merchants, priests, and administrators. The temples serve not only as religious centres, but as economic institutions that coordinate the collection and redistribution of agricultural surplus. Wealthy donors contribute rice, land, and labour to the temples, which in turn support elaborate festivals, maintain schools and libraries, and commission the artistic and architectural projects that employ so many skilled workers. The remarkable prosperity and cultural achievements that flourished within the water-engineered landscape of Angkor were sustained by a form of political authority unlike anything that had existed before in Southeast Asia. To understand how the Khmer Empire functioned at its height, you must grasp the fundamental truth that in this hydraulic civilization, political power and the control of water had become so thoroughly intertwined that they were, in essence, the same thing. The king who could command the flow of water through the canal systems possessed a form of legitimacy that went far deeper than military conquest or hereditary right. The concept of the Devaraja, the god king, was not merely a religious doctrine but a practical theory of governance that made sense only in the context of a water-dependent civilization. When a Khmer ruler claimed divine status, he was asserting his unique ability to mediate between the natural forces that governed the monsoon cycles and the human society that depended entirely upon the reliable distribution of water. This was not an abstract theological claim, but a concrete promise that the king possessed the knowledge, authority, and spiritual power necessary to maintain the hydraulic systems upon which everyone's survival depended. Consider the immense practical responsibilities that this divine authority entailed. The successful operation of the Angkor water system required coordination across hundreds of square miles and involved the labour of tens of thousands of workers. Canal networks had to be maintained in perfect synchronization, with repairs and improvements timed to avoid disrupting agricultural cycles. The release of water from reservoirs had to be carefully scheduled to ensure that irrigation reached all agricultural areas at the proper times. Disputes over water rights between different communities had to be resolved quickly and fairly to prevent conflicts that could undermine the entire system. Only a centralized authority with both technical expertise and unquestioned legitimacy could manage such a complex undertaking. The king's divine status gave him the moral authority to make decisions that affected the livelihoods of entire populations, while his court included the engineers, hydraulic specialists, and administrators who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to translate royal commands into practical action. The elaborate rituals and ceremonies that surrounded the monarchy were not empty pageantry, but essential demonstrations of the king's continued ability to maintain the cosmic and hydraulic order upon which civilization depended. The seasonal rhythm of these royal rituals reflected the agricultural calendar that governed life throughout the empire. At the beginning of each monsoon season, elaborate ceremonies marked the king's symbolic role in calling forth the life-giving rains. During the dry months, other rituals celebrated the opening of the reservoir gates and the beginning of the irrigation season. These were not merely religious observances, but public demonstrations of the monarchy's active role in managing the water resources that sustained the kingdom. The administration of labour for the construction and maintenance of hydraulic infrastructure created a complex web of obligations and relationships that bound the entire population to the royal authority. Every able-bodied person owed a certain amount of work time each year to the collective project of maintaining the water system. This was not taxation in the modern sense, but a form of corvée labour that recognised everyone's stake in the continued functioning of the irrigation network. The king's ability to organise and coordinate this vast labour force was both a demonstration and a source of his political power. The redistribution of the agricultural surplus generated by irrigated agriculture created another layer of royal authority and social cohesion. The temples served not only as religious centres, but as economic institutions that collected, stored, and redistributed rice and other agricultural products. Wealthy landowners contributed portions of their harvest to the temples, which used these resources to feed the armies of craftsmen, priests, and administrators who served the state. The king, as the ultimate patron of the temples, controlled this flow of resources and used it to reward loyalty and punish opposition. This temple-state relationship created a unique form of political economy where religious devotion, economic activity, and hydraulic management were seamlessly integrated. The construction of a new temple was simultaneously a religious act, an economic investment, and a hydraulic engineering project. The moats and reservoirs that surrounded temple complexes served practical functions in the irrigation system, while also fulfilling symbolic roles in religious cosmology. The priests who performed daily rituals in the temples also supervised the maintenance of the water control structures that regulated flow to nearby agricultural areas. The stability of this system depended upon the continued ability of the monarchy to deliver on its fundamental promise, that the waters would flow reliably and abundantly to sustain the prosperity of the kingdom. This created a form of political accountability that was both more direct and more demanding than systems based on military power or hereditary succession. A king might survive military defeats or economic setbacks, but if the irrigation system failed and crops withered in the fields, his divine authority would be called into question in the most fundamental way possible. The success of the hydraulic state also created its own vulnerabilities. The centralized knowledge and authority necessary to manage such a complex water system meant that disruptions at the highest levels of government could have catastrophic consequences for the entire civilization. If the technical expertise required to maintain the canal networks was lost, if the administrative systems that coordinated labour and resources broke down, if the religious and political authority of the monarchy was undermined, the entire edifice of hydraulic civilization could begin to crumble with surprising speed. The magnificent hydraulic infrastructure and the sophisticated political system that governed it provided the foundation for achievements that transcended the merely practical concerns of water management and agricultural production. Rising above the engineered landscape of canals and reservoirs, the great stone temples of Angkor represented the full flowering of a civilization that had learned to transform not only the natural environment, but also the human imagination, creating works of art and architecture that embodied an entire worldview carved in imperishable stone. Walk with me through the outer galleries of Angkor Wat in the hushed moments before dawn, when the first light begins, to illuminate the intricate carvings that cover every surface of this vast temple complex. The stone beneath your feet has been polished smooth by centuries of barefoot pilgrims, and the air carries the faint fragrance of incense from the inner sanctuaries where priests have already begun their daily rituals. As your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the stone lattice windows, you begin to perceive the extraordinary artistic achievement that surrounds you on every side. The walls of the temple are not merely decorated but completely transformed into a vast narrative sculpture that tells the stories central to Hindu cosmology and Khmer identity. Miles of bas-relief carvings depict scenes from the great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, rendered with a level of artistic sophistication that rivals the greatest achievements of classical antiquity. But these are not simply illustrations of ancient texts. They are reinterpretations that reflect the unique cultural synthesis that had emerged in the Khmer Empire, where Indian religious and philosophical traditions had been transformed by contact with local beliefs and practices. The famous scene of the churning of the ocean of milk, which stretches for more than 100 feet along the Eastern Gallery, demonstrates the extraordinary artistic vision of the temple's creators. Ranks of gods and demons pull upon the serpent that serves as a rope, causing the cosmic mountain to rotate and churn the primordial ocean to produce the elixir of immortality. But this is not merely a mythological scene, it is also a sophisticated metaphor for the hydraulic civilization that the Khmer had created. Just as the gods and demons cooperated to churn the cosmic waters and produce divine abundance, so the people of Angkor had learned to cooperate in the management of earthly waters to produce agricultural abundance. The integration of hydraulic engineering and sacred architecture reaches its most perfect expression in the temple's relationship to its surrounding moat and the broader water system of which it forms a part. The rectangular moat that encircles Angkor Wat is not merely a decorative feature, but an integral component of the regional irrigation network. During the dry season, water from this moat flows through carefully designed channels to irrigate nearby rice fields. During the flood season, the moat serves as a temporary reservoir that helps regulate water levels throughout the surrounding area. But the moat also serves a profound symbolic function that reveals the cosmological thinking of the temple's designers. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, the universe consists of concentric rings of continents separated by cosmic oceans, with Mount Meru, the axis of the world, rising from the centre. The temple complex, with its central towers representing Mount Meru and its surrounding moat representing the cosmic ocean, is thus a microcosm of the entire universe, a three-dimensional mandala, constructed in stone and water. This symbolic geography becomes even more sophisticated when you understand the astronomical alignments that govern the temple's orientation and proportions. The entire complex is positioned so that on the spring equinox, an observer standing at the western entrance can watch the sun rise directly over the central tower of the temple. The proportional relationships between different elements of the architecture correspond to significant astronomical cycles, encoding in stone a complex calendar system that reflects the Khmer understanding of cosmic time. Move now to the Bayon, the temple that served as the spiritual centre of Angkor Thom, the great walled city constructed by Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century. Here, the artistic vision of the Khmer reaches perhaps its most distinctive expression in the massive stone faces that gaze out from the towers of the temple. These serene countenances, each measuring several feet in height, combine features of the Buddha with those of the king himself, creating a powerful visual statement about the unity of spiritual and temporal authority. The galleries of the Bayon are decorated with scenes that provide us with our most detailed glimpse into daily life in the Khmer Empire at its height. Unlike the mythological scenes that dominate Angkor Wat, these carvings depict the contemporary world of the 12th century. Markets bustling with activity, fishermen working in the flooded forests around Tonle Sap, farmers transplanting rice in irrigated fields, merchants travelling along the great highways, and naval battles fought on rivers and lakes. The artistic achievement represented by these temple complexes required not only inspired vision, but also extraordinary technical mastery and organisational capability. The sandstone used in construction had to be quarried from hills located more than 20 miles away, then transported by river and canal to the construction sites. Each block had to be cut to precise specifications and fitted into place with mathematical accuracy. The bas-relief carvings required years of patient work by teams of skilled sculptors who had mastered techniques of stone carving that allowed them to create works of extraordinary delicacy and refinement. The religious life that these temples were designed to support integrated the seasonal rhythms of the agricultural calendar with elaborate ceremonial cycles that celebrated the cosmic principles embodied in the architecture itself. During the great festivals, thousands of pilgrims would journey to Angkor from throughout the empire and beyond, creating temporary cities of tents and temporary structures around the permanent stone temples. The sound of chanting, the fragrance of incense, and the sight of countless oil lamps reflected in the temple moats created an atmosphere of spiritual intensity that reinforced the connection between the earthly kingdom and the cosmic order it was believed to represent. The magnificent temples and sophisticated water management systems that we have explored were not the products of an isolated civilization, but rather the achievements of a kingdom that stood at the centre of vast networks of trade and cultural exchange stretching across Southeast Asia and beyond. To understand Angkor at its height, you must see it not as a self-contained world, but as the hub of a great wheel of commerce and communication that connected the rice fields of Cambodia to the spice markets of Java, the silk workshops of China, and the temple cities of India. The same hydraulic infrastructure that sustained the agricultural abundance of the Angkor region also provided the foundation for a transportation network that could move goods and people across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. The canals that carried irrigation water to the rice fields also served as highways for commerce, allowing boats to travel deep into the interior of the empire during both the wet and dry seasons. Along these waterways moved not only the agricultural surplus of the region, but also the exotic goods that flowed through Angkor from the far reaches of the known world. Imagine yourself as a merchant travelling northward along the Siem Reap River toward the great temple complexes. Your boat is loaded with goods that tell the story of Angkor's connections to distant lands. Chinese ceramics packed carefully in rice straw, Indian textiles dyed with colours that have no names in the Khmer language, metalwork from the workshops of Java, and precious stones that have travelled overland from the mines of Burma. The gentle current carries you past rice fields and temple complexes, past smaller boats carrying local products toward regional markets, past the carefully maintained stone embankments that channel the river's flow according to the grand design of the hydraulic engineers. As you approach the urban core of Angkor, the river traffic becomes denser and more diverse. Barges carry massive blocks of sandstone from the distant quarries where the temple building materials are cut and shaped. Smaller vessels transport the daily necessities of urban life: rice from the surrounding agricultural areas, fish from the seasonal lakes, fruits and vegetables from the market gardens that flourish in the well-watered suburbs. The waterways hum with activity from dawn to dusk, creating a liquid highway system that rivals in its sophistication the road networks of any contemporary civilization. But water transport alone could not sustain the far-reaching commercial connections that made Angkor a centre of international trade. Radiating outward from the temple complexes, a network of raised causeways carried overland traffic to the distant corners of the empire and beyond. These roads were marvels of engineering in their own right, elevated above the seasonal flood levels on foundations of carefully laid stone, wide enough to accommodate the ox carts and elephant, trains that carried bulk goods across the landscape. The most famous of these highways stretched eastward from Angkor toward the ancient port cities, along the coast of what is now Vietnam. This route, which required the construction of numerous bridges and embankments to carry it across rivers and seasonal wetlands, provided a direct overland connection between the inland empire and the maritime trading networks of the South China Sea. Along this road travelled the products of Khmer craftsmen bound for distant markets, as well as the foreign goods that flowed back toward the temple cities of the interior. Other roads connected Angkor to the emerging Thai kingdoms to the west, to the trading cities along the Mekong River to the south, and to the overland routes that carried goods northward toward China. At regular intervals along these highways, the Khmer constructed rest houses and supply depots that could provision merchants and their pack animals during long journeys. These way stations became centres of local commerce in their own right, attracting settlements of craftsmen and traders who specialised in serving the needs of long-distance travellers. The goods that flowed along these trade routes reflected the remarkable diversity of economic activity that the stability of the Khmer Empire had made possible. From the workshops of Angkor came carved stone sculptures and architectural elements that were prized throughout Southeast Asia for their artistic excellence and religious significance. Khmer metalworkers produced bronze sculptures and ceremonial objects using techniques that combined local traditions with influences absorbed from Indian and Chinese craftsmen. The textile workshops of the empire created silk and cotton fabrics that incorporated design elements drawn from across the trading networks of the region. In exchange for these manufactured goods, Angkor imported the raw materials and luxury items that its own territory could not provide. Chinese merchants brought porcelain, silk, and tea, as well as the silver coins that served as a medium of exchange throughout much of Southeast Asia. Indian traders carried precious stones, fine metalwork, and the Sanskrit texts that provided the intellectual and religious foundation for much of Khmer high culture. From the archipelagos to the south came spices, aromatic woods, and the exotic products of tropical forests and coral reefs. The cultural exchanges that accompanied this commercial activity were as important as the movement of goods themselves. Scholars and religious teachers travelled along the trade routes, carrying with them new ideas about art, architecture, religion, and statecraft. The great temple complexes of Angkor became centres of learning that attracted students and pilgrims from across Southeast Asia, creating a cosmopolitan intellectual environment where ideas from many different traditions could meet and interact. The economic prosperity generated by this extensive trade network provided the resources necessary to sustain the massive construction projects and elaborate court life that characterized the golden age of the Khmer Empire. The taxes and tribute collected from merchant activity helped fund the armies of craftsmen who built the temples, the engineers who maintained the hydraulic systems, and the administrators who governed the vast territorial expanse of the kingdom. Even as the great temples rose toward their full glory, and the trade networks reached their maximum extent, subtle changes were beginning to manifest in the physical landscape that sustained the entire civilization. These were not dramatic transformations that announced themselves with obvious signs of crisis, but rather the slow accumulation of small alterations that would, over time, undermine the delicate environmental balance upon which the hydraulic empire depended. To perceive these early warnings, you must train your eye to see the almost imperceptible shifts that were occurring in the behaviour of water and earth throughout the Angkor region. Walk with me along one of the main canals that carry water from the great reservoirs toward the agricultural areas, but imagine that you are visiting this waterway not in its prime, but during the later decades of the empire's golden age. At first glance, the canal appears to function exactly as its original designers intended. Water flows steadily along its stone-lined course, carrying life to the rice fields and urban areas downstream. But if you look more carefully, you begin to notice subtle differences that speak to changes in the broader watershed that feeds this hydraulic system. The water itself seems somehow heavier, carrying a burden of sediment that was not present in earlier centuries. When you scoop up a handful of the canal water, you can feel the gritty texture of suspended particles against your skin. When you allow the water to settle in a container, a thin layer of silt accumulates at the bottom, testament to the erosion that is occurring somewhere upstream. This sediment comes from the gradual clearing of forests in the Kulin Hills and other upland areas that form the natural catchment area for the Angkor water system. The deforestation is itself a consequence of the empire's success and expansion. As the population has grown and the demand for agricultural land has increased, farmers have pushed into marginal areas that were previously left as forest. The slopes of the hills that ring the Great Plain have been cleared to create new fields and settlements. The trees that once held the soil in place with their root systems have been cut for timber and fuel, leaving the earth exposed to the erosive power of the monsoon rains. During the dry season, when you can walk along the beds of seasonal streams that feed into the main canal system, the evidence of this upstream erosion becomes even more apparent. The channels are clogged with sand and gravel that has washed down from the denuded hillsides. Small gullies have formed where concentrated runoff has carved new pathways through the landscape. The natural vegetation that once lined these watercourses has been replaced by scrubland that provides little protection against soil loss. The accumulating sediment is not merely an aesthetic problem, but a serious threat to the functioning of the entire hydraulic system. As silt settles in the reservoirs, their capacity to store water gradually diminishes. The great barrays that were designed to hold vast quantities of water for release during the dry season begin to fill up with sediment, reducing their effectiveness as drought insurance for the agricultural areas that depend upon them. The rate of sedimentation has accelerated beyond what the original designers of the system anticipated, and the regular maintenance that once kept the reservoirs clear has not kept pace with the increased sediment load. In the canals themselves, the accumulating sediment creates new problems that compound over time. As the channels become shallower due to silt deposition, their capacity to carry water during peak flow periods is reduced. This means that during the monsoon season, when the system needs to handle large volumes of runoff, the channels are more likely to overflow their banks, causing flooding in areas that were previously protected. The carefully calculated gradients that allow water to flow smoothly through the distribution network become disrupted as sediment accumulates unevenly, creating new bottlenecks and flow restrictions. The changes in the upland watersheds have also altered the timing and character of water flow throughout the system. The forests that once absorbed and gradually released monsoon rainfall have been replaced by cleared land that sheds water much more rapidly. This means that during heavy rains, the runoff reaches the canal system in concentrated pulses, rather than the steady, predictable flows that the infrastructure was designed to handle. The result is increased stress on embankments, control structures, and distribution channels that must now cope with more extreme variations in water volume. Even more subtly, the quality of the water flowing through the system has begun to change. The sediment carried by the increased erosion is not merely inert sand and clay, but also includes organic matter from cleared vegetation and agricultural runoff. This organic load begins to accumulate in the quieter waters of the reservoirs, where it decomposes and affects the chemical balance of the stored water. Areas of standing water that once remained clear and fresh throughout the dry season begin to show signs of eutrophication, with algae blooms and other indicators of declining water quality. The hydraulic engineers and maintenance crews who work throughout the canal system are among the first to notice these changes, but their observations are not immediately translated into policy adjustments or systematic responses. The alterations are gradual enough that they can be accommodated through incremental modifications to maintenance routines and operational procedures. A canal that becomes clogged with sediment can be dredged. A reservoir that shows signs of reduced capacity can be cleaned and deepened. The system retains enough redundancy and flexibility to absorb these early stresses without obvious failure. While the subtle environmental stresses we have explored were quietly undermining the physical foundations of the Khmer Empire, equally significant changes were taking place in the realm of belief and royal authority that would prove even more decisive in determining the civilization's ultimate fate. These transformations in religious practice and political ideology unfolded with the same gradual, almost imperceptible character as the environmental changes, but their cumulative effect was to erode the spiritual and institutional foundations that had sustained the hydraulic state for centuries. To understand this transformation, you must first appreciate the central role that Hindu kingship and temple building had played in legitimizing royal authority and organizing the massive labor efforts required to maintain the water management systems. The concept of the Devaraja, the god-king, was not merely a religious doctrine but the essential ideological framework that made possible the coordination of thousands of workers across vast distances and extended periods of time. When that framework began to weaken, the entire system of centralized water management became vulnerable in ways that were not immediately apparent. The first signs of this ideological shift appear in the stone inscriptions that provide our most direct evidence of royal intentions and religious practices. For centuries, the temples of Angkor had been adorned with elaborate Sanskrit inscriptions that proclaimed the divine nature of the kings who built them, detailed the religious ceremonies that were performed within their walls, and recorded the grants of land and labor that sustained the temple establishments. These inscriptions were not merely decorative elements, but essential components of the religious and political system that bound the empire together. But beginning in the late 13th century, these Sanskrit inscriptions become less frequent and less elaborate. The last major Sanskrit inscription at Angkor dates to the year 1327, marking the end of a tradition that had flourished for more than 5 centuries. This silence in stone reflects a broader transformation in the religious life of the empire, as the elaborate Hindu rituals that had once validated royal authority gradually gave way to simpler forms of Buddhist practice that required less centralized organization and less monumental expression. The Buddhism that began to gain influence in the later period of the Khmer Empire was not the Mahayana tradition that had coexisted with Hinduism in earlier centuries, but rather the Theravada school that was spreading throughout mainland Southeast Asia from its centers in Sri Lanka and Burma. This form of Buddhism emphasized individual spiritual development and the authority of the monastic community, rather than the cosmic role of divine kings and the elaborate temple establishments that served them. The practical implications of this religious transformation were profound. The great temple-building projects that had characterized the golden age of the empire required not only enormous resources, but also a shared belief in the cosmic significance of monumental architecture. When the religious worldview that gave meaning to these projects began to change, the motivation for such massive undertakings naturally diminished. Kings continued to sponsor religious establishments, but their patronage increasingly took the form of smaller, simpler monasteries rather than the vast temple complexes that had defined earlier centuries. This shift in royal patronage had direct consequences for the maintenance of the hydraulic infrastructure. The temple establishments had not only served religious functions, but had also acted as economic institutions that organized agricultural production and coordinated the labor necessary to maintain canals, reservoirs, and embankments. The great temples owned vast estates worked by thousands of people, whose labor was dedicated not only to agricultural production, but also to the upkeep of the water systems that made that production possible. As royal enthusiasm for temple building declined and resources were redirected toward other forms of religious expression, the institutional framework that had sustained hydraulic maintenance began to weaken. The armies of workers who had once been organized through the temple system to dredge canals, repair embankments, and maintain control structures found themselves without the centralized coordination that had made such large-scale projects possible. The changing religious atmosphere also affected the broader population's relationship to the water management systems. Under the earlier Hindu-influenced system, participation in hydraulic maintenance had been not merely a practical necessity, but a form of religious service that contributed to the cosmic order embodied in the temple state. The regular cycles of dredging and repair had been accompanied by rituals that reinforced the spiritual significance of the work and the divine authority of the rulers who organized it. But as Theravada Buddhism gained influence, with its emphasis on individual spiritual development and its skepticism toward elaborate ritual and monumental display, the religious motivation for participating in large-scale public works projects naturally diminished. The maintenance of canals and reservoirs came to be seen more as a burden imposed by secular authority than as a form of spiritual practice that served cosmic purposes. The kings themselves, influenced by the changing religious climate, began to seek legitimacy through different means than the elaborate hydraulic projects and temple-building campaigns that had validated royal authority in earlier centuries. Buddhist kingship emphasized moral virtue and support for the monastic community rather than the cosmic engineering projects that had defined the Devaraja tradition. This was not necessarily a less effective form of royal authority, but it was one that was less closely tied to the intensive management of water resources. The transformation was gradual and uneven, with different regions and different segments of the population adopting the new religious practices at different rates. Some areas continued to maintain the older traditions of Hindu temple service and hydraulic cooperation, long after the royal court had shifted toward Buddhist forms of expression. But the overall trend was clear. The ideological framework that had made the Khmer Empire's remarkable achievements in water management possible was slowly dissolving. The environmental and ideological changes that we have explored were unfolding against the backdrop of an even more fundamental transformation that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Khmer Empire itself. Across the entire globe, the climate system that had remained relatively stable for centuries was beginning to shift in ways that would test the resilience of civilizations from Europe to East Asia. The Angkor region, with its sophisticated but ultimately fragile hydraulic infrastructure, would prove particularly vulnerable to these broader patterns of climatic change. To understand the full scope of the challenge that confronted the water-dependent civilization of the Khmer, you must imagine the vast atmospheric engine that governs weather patterns across Southeast Asia and beyond. The monsoon system that had provided the predictable seasonal rhythm of wet and dry periods for centuries was itself part of a much larger pattern of ocean temperatures, atmospheric pressures, and wind systems that stretched across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. When these broader patterns began to shift, the local consequences in Cambodia would be both subtle and devastating. The evidence for these climatic changes comes to us not from written records, which are sparse for this period, but from the patient work of modern scientists who have learned to read the history of climate in tree rings, sediment cores, and the layered deposits of minerals in ancient caves. These natural archives tell a story of gradual but inexorable change beginning in the 13th century and accelerating through the 14th and 15th centuries. What they reveal is a climate system moving away from the relatively stable and predictable patterns that had sustained the golden age of Angkor toward a new regime characterized by greater variability and more extreme events. The tree rings preserved in the forests surrounding Angkor record years of unusual stress, seasons, when growth slowed dramatically as trees struggled with conditions unlike anything in their previous experience. These botanical memories, decoded by scientists who can read the annual patterns of cellular growth, reveal a series of severe droughts punctuated by periods of excessive rainfall that would have tested the limits of even the most sophisticated water management systems. In the caves that honeycomb the limestone hills north of Angkor, mineral deposits called speleothems have grown layer by layer over thousands of years, each thin band recording the chemical signature of the rainwater that seeped through the rock above. When scientists analyze these ancient formations, they find clear evidence of the changing precipitation patterns that began to affect the region during the later centuries of the Khmer Empire. The isotopic composition of the minerals reveals not just how much rain fell, but when it fell, and how the seasonal distribution of precipitation was shifting in ways that would have profound implications for agricultural planning and water storage. Perhaps most telling are the sediment cores extracted from the bottom of lakes and reservoirs throughout the region. These underwater archives preserve a year-by-year record of environmental conditions stretching back centuries. The layers of sediment tell the story of drought years when little material washed into the lakes, alternating with periods of intense erosion when heavy rains carried massive loads of soil and organic matter into the water bodies. The pattern that emerges from these natural records is one of increasing climatic instability, with more frequent oscillations between extreme conditions. The hydraulic infrastructure of Angkor had been designed during a period of relative climatic stability, when the monsoon arrived with reasonable predictability, and the dry season followed patterns that allowed for careful planning of water storage and release. The reservoirs had been sized to capture the typical seasonal surplus and store it for distribution during the predictable months of scarcity. The canal networks had been engineered to handle the normal range of flows, from the peak volumes of the monsoon season to the minimal flows of the driest months. But as the climate system began to shift toward greater extremes, these carefully calculated parameters were no longer adequate. Drought years became more severe than the system's designers had anticipated, depleting reservoirs that had been expected to maintain adequate water supplies throughout the dry season. When the rains did return, they often came with an intensity that overwhelmed canals and embankments that had been built to accommodate more moderate flows. The timing of seasonal changes also became less predictable, disrupting the agricultural calendar that had coordinated planting and harvesting across the entire region. Farmers who had learned to expect the monsoon's arrival within a narrow window of time found themselves dealing with seasons that began weeks earlier or later than expected. The careful synchronization between rice cultivation cycles and water availability began to break down, creating food security challenges that rippled through the entire economic system. These climatic stresses interacted with the environmental and social changes we have already explored in ways that amplified their individual effects. The deforestation and soil erosion that had increased the sediment load in the canal system made the waterways more vulnerable to blockage during the intense rainfall events that were becoming more common. The weakening of the institutional mechanisms that had once coordinated large-scale maintenance projects meant that the hydraulic infrastructure was less able to adapt to the new climatic challenges. The convergence of environmental stress, institutional weakness, and climatic instability that we have traced through the preceding decades was about to manifest itself in the most direct and devastating way possible, through the failure of the water systems that had sustained the entire civilization. The evidence for this collapse comes to us not from dramatic written accounts, which are largely absent from this period, but from the patient scientific analysis of sediment cores extracted from the great reservoirs of Angkor. These underwater archives tell a story of hydraulic catastrophe that unfolded with inexorable logic once the various stresses on the system reached a critical threshold. Stand with me beside the West Baray, the largest of the great reservoirs that had once been the crown jewel of Khmer hydraulic engineering. In its prime, this artificial lake had stretched for nearly 5 miles across the landscape, its carefully constructed embankments containing enough water to irrigate vast areas during the dry season, while also serving as a visible symbol of royal power over the forces of nature. But by the 14th century, this magnificent achievement of human engineering had become something very different, a testament to the fragility of even the most sophisticated attempts to control environmental systems. The sediment cores extracted from the bottom of the West Baray reveal the story of its decline with scientific precision. For centuries, these cores show the reservoir had accumulated sediment at steady, predictable rates, as silt-laden water flowed in during the monsoon season and settled gradually to the bottom during the dry months. The annual layers of sediment, like tree rings, recorded the rhythm of a functioning hydraulic system that captured and stored water with remarkable consistency year after year. But beginning in the 14th century, something dramatic changed. The rate at which sediment accumulated in the reservoir dropped by an order of magnitude, a decline so steep and so sustained that it could only mean one thing. The West Baray was no longer receiving the flows of water that had sustained it for centuries. The reservoir was not just running low, it was being systematically deprived of the water sources that had originally filled it. This transformation represents one of the most dramatic infrastructure failures in human history, yet it occurred without fanfare or dramatic announcements. The great reservoir simply began to empty, its water levels dropping year by year as the inflows that had once replenished it failed to materialize. The carefully engineered intake channels that had once carried water from distant rivers began to run dry. The distribution canals that had once carried irrigation water to thousands of acres of rice fields carried less and less water each season, until many of them contained nothing but cracked mud and dying vegetation. The failure of the West Baray was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of hydraulic collapse that affected water management systems throughout the Angkor region. Smaller reservoirs that had depended on seasonal streams found their sources reduced to intermittent trickles. Canal networks that had once formed an integrated system for moving water across vast distances broke down into isolated segments as key connecting channels failed to carry adequate flows. The intricate web of hydraulic infrastructure that had sustained the empire for centuries was fragmenting into a collection of failing, disconnected components. The agricultural implications of this water shortage were immediate and catastrophic. Rice cultivation, which had provided the foundation for the entire economic system, became increasingly unreliable as irrigation water became scarce and unpredictable. Fields that had produced abundant harvests for generations were abandoned as farmers found themselves unable to maintain the controlled flooding conditions that rice cultivation requires. The suburban landscape of small farms and market gardens that had once surrounded the great temple complexes began to empty as rural communities migrated toward areas where water was still available. The urban areas that had flourished around the temple complexes found themselves in an equally precarious situation. The dense concentrations of craftsmen, merchants, administrators, and religious specialists who had created the sophisticated culture of Angkor depended entirely upon the agricultural surplus generated by irrigated rice cultivation. As that surplus dwindled due to water shortages, the economic foundation for urban life began to crumble. Workshops that had once produced luxury goods for local consumption and distant trade were abandoned as their customers and patrons could no longer afford their products. The failure of the water systems also had profound implications for public health and basic survival. The reservoirs and canals had not only provided irrigation water, but had also served as the source of drinking water for the urban population. As these water sources dried up or became contaminated with stagnant, algae-laden water, communities found themselves facing shortages of potable water that made continued habitation increasingly difficult. The social and political consequences of hydraulic failure were equally severe. The kings and administrators who had legitimized their authority through their ability to maintain the water systems found themselves confronted with a crisis that exposed the fundamental weakness of their position. The elaborate rituals and ceremonies that had once celebrated the opening of reservoir gates and the beginning of irrigation seasons became hollow mockeries when there was no water to release. The divine authority of the Devaraja, already undermined by changing religious practices, was further eroded by the visible failure of the hydraulic infrastructure that had been its most concrete manifestation. As devastating as the drought-induced failure of the reservoir systems had been, the hydraulic infrastructure of Angkor was about to face an even more destructive challenge from the opposite extreme. The same climatic instability that had brought unprecedented dry periods to the region was also generating monsoon seasons of extraordinary intensity, rainfall events that would overwhelm waterworks originally designed for more moderate flows. What drought had weakened, flood would destroy, completing the systematic dismantling of the world's most sophisticated medieval water management system. Picture yourself standing beside one of the main canals during what should have been the gentle onset of a typical monsoon season. In earlier centuries, you would have witnessed the careful, controlled filling of the waterways as the first rains began to replenish the system after months of dry season water management. The flows would have built gradually, allowing operators time to adjust gates and control structures, ensuring that the increased water volume was distributed efficiently throughout the irrigation network. But the monsoon that arrives now is unlike anything the system's designers had envisioned. The rain begins not with the customary gentle morning showers that gradually intensify over weeks, but with violent downpours that seem to empty the entire sky in a matter of hours. The sound is overwhelming, a constant roar that drowns out all other noise as water cascades from the heavens with an intensity that makes visibility impossible beyond a few yards. The canal beside you, which only days earlier had been a sluggish stream carrying the last reserves of stored water to struggling crops, transforms into a raging torrent that tears at its carefully constructed banks. The stone lining that had protected the channel walls for centuries begins to shift and crack under the pressure of flows far exceeding its design capacity. Debris swept down from the deforested watersheds upstream crashes into control structures and bridge supports, creating temporary dams that cause water to back up and overflow in areas that had never experienced flooding. The engineering principles that had governed the construction of the hydraulic infrastructure centuries earlier had assumed a certain range of flows, from the minimal trickles of the dry season to the substantial but manageable volumes of a typical monsoon. The canals had been sized, graded, and reinforced based on these historical patterns. The embankments that contained the reservoirs had been built to withstand water levels that, while high, remained within the bounds of previous experience. The spillways and overflow channels had been designed to handle surplus water during unusually wet years, but not the torrential volumes that were now becoming commonplace. Under the assault of these extreme flows, the accumulated weaknesses in the system began to manifest themselves in cascading failures that spread rapidly throughout the network. An embankment that had been weakened by years of deferred maintenance due to institutional breakdown finally gave way under the pressure of unprecedented water levels. The resulting breach sent a wall of water rushing across agricultural areas that had been protected from flooding for centuries, carrying away not only crops and buildings, but also the smaller dikes and channels that formed the local irrigation infrastructure. The flooding was particularly destructive because it occurred in a system that was already severely compromised by drought damage and neglect. Canals that had been clogged with sediment from upstream erosion could not handle the sudden surge of storm runoff, causing water to spill over their banks and carve new channels that bypassed the control structures entirely. Reservoirs whose capacity had been reduced by siltation were overwhelmed by inflows that would have been manageable when the basins were clear and deep. The timing of these extreme weather events compounded their destructive effects. The intense monsoons often followed immediately after severe droughts, striking infrastructure and agricultural systems that had been weakened by years of water shortage. Embankments that had dried and cracked during extended dry periods were particularly vulnerable to erosion when the floods arrived. Canal linings that had shifted and settled during drought conditions provided inadequate protection against the scouring effects of high-velocity flows. Modern computer modelling of the Angkor water system helps us understand how these extreme events created unstable feedback loops that amplified their destructive effects. A single breach in a major embankment could disrupt water flows throughout an entire sub-basin, causing control structures downstream to operate under conditions they were never designed to handle. The failure of one reservoir could send surge flows into canals that then overflowed and damaged other parts of the system, creating a domino effect of infrastructure failure that spread far beyond the original point of damage. The human response to these cascading failures was hampered by the same institutional weaknesses that had contributed to the system's vulnerability in the first place. The centralized authority and technical expertise that would have been necessary to coordinate emergency repairs and restoration efforts had been eroded by decades of political and religious change. Local communities, faced with the immediate necessity of protecting their own homes and fields, had neither the resources nor the organizational capacity to address problems that affected the broader regional infrastructure. The agricultural implications of the flood damage were as severe as those of the earlier droughts, but manifested in different ways. Instead of crops withering in dry fields, farmers now watched their rice paddies being scoured away by torrential flows or buried under loads of sediment and debris carried by the floodwaters. The careful terracing and field preparation that had taken generations to perfect was destroyed in a matter of hours, leaving behind a chaotic landscape of gullies, sand deposits, and standing water that would take years to restore even under the best of circumstances. The hydraulic catastrophes and climatic extremes that devastated the water management systems throughout the Angkor region had profound consequences for the great temple complexes that had served as the spiritual and administrative heart of the empire. But the story told by these sacred precincts is not one of sudden abandonment or dramatic collapse, but rather of a more subtle and gradual transformation that reveals itself only through the patient analysis of archaeological evidence. To understand what happened during the crisis centuries, you must learn to read the whispered testimony of objects buried in earth, of carbon traces embedded in ancient organic matter, and of the patterns revealed by the absence of human activity as much as by its presence. Walk with me through the vast enclosure of Angkor Wat during what would have been the height of the 14th century crisis. The great temple itself still dominates the landscape, its towers rising majestically above the surrounding plain, its stone walls bearing the same intricate carvings that had been completed centuries earlier. At first glance, little seems to have changed since the golden age of Khmer civilization. The fundamental architecture remains intact, the causeways still stretch across the ancient moat, and the basic infrastructure of the temple complex shows no obvious signs of catastrophic damage. But as you move through the galleries and courtyards, a more careful observer would begin to notice subtle signs of change in the human patterns that had once animated these spaces. The sound of your footsteps echoes differently in chambers that once bustled with the activity of priests, pilgrims, and temple functionaries. The stone floors, polished smooth by centuries of use, now accumulate dust and fallen leaves in corners that would once have been swept clean daily. Small shrines that had once been maintained with fresh offerings and burning incense show signs of neglect, their surfaces dulled by the accumulated patina of months or years without regular attention. The most telling evidence comes not from what is visible, but from what lies buried in the occupation mounds that surround the main temple structures. These artificial hills, built up over generations by the accumulated debris of daily life, contain within their layered deposits a detailed record of human activity spanning centuries. Archaeological excavations of these mounds reveal a pattern that would be invisible to casual observation, but speaks with scientific precision about the changing intensity of occupation within the temple complex. The technique of radiocarbon dating, applied to organic materials recovered from these deposits, reveals a remarkable chronological pattern. The steady accumulation of household refuse, food remains, pottery fragments, and other indicators of daily life that had characterized earlier centuries shows a dramatic interruption beginning sometime in the late 12th or 13th century. This interruption, which archaeologists refer to as a chronometric gap, extends through the 14th and into the early 15th century, representing a period when the temple complex supported far fewer inhabitants than it had during its peak centuries. This gap in occupation does not represent the complete abandonment that romantic narratives of lost civilizations might suggest, but rather a fundamental reorganization of how the temple spaces were used and by whom. The evidence suggests that while the complex no longer functioned as the bustling religious and administrative center it had once been, it continued to serve important ceremonial and spiritual functions for much smaller communities. The archaeological record shows sporadic reuse of certain areas, temporary occupations that left lighter traces in the soil, and the continued maintenance of core religious functions even as the broader infrastructure of temple administration collapsed. The pattern revealed by scientific dating techniques tells a story of gradual decline rather than sudden catastrophe. The Great Temple had not been sacked by invading armies or destroyed by natural disaster, but had instead experienced a slow hemorrhaging of population and activity as the broader economic and social systems that had sustained it gradually failed. The priests and temple functionaries, the craftsmen and merchants, the pilgrims and administrative officials who had once made the complex a thriving centre of activity had simply drifted away over a period of decades as opportunities and necessities drew them elsewhere. The reoccupation that began in the late 15th century and continued sporadically into the 17th and 18th centuries represents a different kind of relationship between people and the sacred space. The new inhabitants were likely smaller communities who valued the temple's religious significance but lacked the resources and organizational capacity to maintain it at anything approaching its former scale of activity. Their use of the space was more modest, more practical, and more adapted to the reduced circumstances of the post-collapse period. Archaeological evidence from this later period shows innovations and adaptations that reflect the changed conditions. Temporary structures were built within the temple enclosures using wood and other perishable materials that have long since decayed, leaving only subtle traces in the soil. Existing stone structures were modified for new uses, with doorways blocked or opened, spaces subdivided, and drainage systems altered to serve different functions than those originally intended. The moats and water features that surrounded the temple complex continued to serve practical functions, even as their symbolic significance may have diminished. Water from the temple moats provided irrigation for small-scale agriculture, carried out within the temple grounds themselves. The elevated causeways became convenient sites for temporary settlements that took advantage of good drainage and existing infrastructure while remaining above the level of seasonal flooding. The gradual abandonment of the great temple complexes and the failure of the hydraulic infrastructure that we have traced through the preceding chapters did not occur in isolation, but were part of a broader pattern of systemic breakdown that affected every aspect of Khmer society. To understand the full scope of what happened to the jungle emperors of Angkor, you must see how the environmental and climatic stresses we have explored interacted with economic, social, and political pressures to create a cascade of failures that ultimately made the continuation of the hydraulic civilization impossible. The agricultural crisis caused by the breakdown of water management systems had immediate and devastating effects on the economic foundation of the empire. The rice surplus that had sustained the elaborate court culture, the monumental building projects, and the extensive trade networks simply disappeared as irrigated fields reverted to seasonal marshland or were abandoned entirely. Without this agricultural foundation, the complex web of economic relationships that had bound the empire together began to unravel with surprising speed. The craftsmen who had created the magnificent sculptures and architectural elements that adorned the temples found themselves without patrons, as the royal court and wealthy temple establishments could no longer afford luxury goods. The metallurgists, textile workers, and other specialists whose products had once been exported throughout Southeast Asia discovered that their skills were no longer in demand as trade networks collapsed and local communities focused on basic survival rather than artistic expression. These skilled workers, along with the merchants, administrators, and religious functionaries who had formed the backbone of urban society, were forced to abandon their specialized roles and return to subsistence agriculture, or migrate to regions where opportunities still existed. The demographic changes that resulted from this economic collapse were profound and self-reinforcing. As the urban population dispersed, the labour force available for maintaining the hydraulic infrastructure was drastically reduced. The canal networks and reservoir systems that had once been maintained by thousands of workers operating under centralised coordination were left to the care of scattered rural communities who lacked both the technical knowledge and the organisational capacity to keep such complex systems functioning. This created a vicious cycle. As maintenance declined, the water systems became less reliable, which further reduced agricultural productivity, which in turn drove more people to abandon the region in search of better opportunities elsewhere. The shift in regional trade patterns compounded these internal problems by redirecting economic activity away from the inland empire toward coastal ports and maritime routes. Throughout Southeast Asia, the 13th and 14th centuries saw the rise of new trading centres located along the coasts, where merchants could take advantage of improved maritime technology and changing patterns of international commerce. Cities like Ayutthaya in Thailand and Malacca in Malaysia began to attract the trade that had once flowed through Angkor, offering advantages in terms of transportation costs, access to international markets, and freedom from the increasingly unreliable political conditions that characterized the declining Khmer Empire. This economic reorientation was not merely a matter of merchant preferences, but reflected fundamental changes in the technology and organization of long-distance trade. The development of larger, more seaworthy vessels reduced the relative importance of overland routes and inland waterways, while the growth of Chinese maritime trade created new opportunities for coastal cities that inland empires could not easily match. Angkor, which had once benefited from its position at the intersection of land and water routes, found itself increasingly isolated as trade patterns shifted toward purely maritime networks. External military pressures added another layer of stress to the already weakening empire. The rising kingdom of Ayutthaya, located in what is now central Thailand, began to assert its independence from Khmer suzerainty and eventually launched direct attacks against Angkorian territories. These conflicts drained resources that might have been used to maintain the hydraulic infrastructure and diverted attention from the environmental crisis that was undermining the empire's foundations. The famous sack of Angkor by Ayutthayan forces in 1431 was not the cause of the empire's decline, but rather the culmination of a long process of weakening that had made effective resistance impossible. The internal political fragmentation that accompanied economic and environmental crisis made coordinated responses to these challenges increasingly difficult. As the central authority of the god kings weakened, regional governors and local strongmen began to assert greater independence, focusing on their own immediate territories rather than on empire-wide concerns. This fragmentation was both a cause and a consequence of the hydraulic crisis. As water management systems failed, local communities were forced to become more self-reliant, but their self-reliance in turn undermined the centralized coordination that the water systems required. The religious and ideological changes that we explored earlier both reflected and reinforced these broader patterns of political fragmentation. The shift toward Theravada Buddhism, with its emphasis on individual spiritual development and local monastic communities, was well suited to the decentralized conditions that were emerging as the old imperial system collapsed. But this religious transformation also weakened the ideological foundations of centralized authority, making it more difficult to organize the large-scale collective efforts that hydraulic maintenance required. The collapse of the hydraulic infrastructure and the multiple crises that had overwhelmed the great temple complexes of Angkor did not spell the end of the Khmer people or their civilization, but rather forced a fundamental adaptation that would reshape the political and cultural geography of Southeast Asia. As the water-dependent empire of the interior proved unsustainable under the new environmental and political conditions, the center of Khmer power began a gradual migration southward toward the great rivers and floodplains that offered different opportunities and different challenges than the engineered landscape they were leaving behind. The movement away from Angkor was not a single dramatic exodus, but rather a long process of demographic and political reorientation that unfolded over several generations. Communities that had depended on the failing irrigation systems began to explore alternative locations where they might re-establish their livelihoods under more reliable conditions. The great river systems of the Mekong and its tributaries, which had always formed part of the broader Khmer world, suddenly appeared more attractive than the increasingly unreliable hydraulic infrastructure of the Angkor region. The Mekong River system offered advantages that became increasingly apparent as the limitations of the Angkor model became clear. Unlike the artificial reservoirs and canals that required constant maintenance and centralized coordination, the Great River provided a natural and reliable source of water that could support agriculture, transportation, and urban development, without the massive infrastructure investments that had characterized the earlier period. The annual flood cycle of the Mekong, fed by monsoons and snowmelt from the distant Tibetan plateau, created natural irrigation patterns that could support intensive rice cultivation without the complex engineering works that had proven so vulnerable to environmental and social disruption. The strategic location of the Mekong floodplains also offered better access to the maritime trade networks that were becoming increasingly important in the regional economy. Instead of depending on overland routes and inland waterways to connect with coastal ports, communities established along the Mekong could take advantage of direct river access to the sea, allowing them to participate more efficiently in the growing commerce between China, India, and the archipelagic regions to the south. The political transformation that accompanied this geographical shift was equally significant. The God-King system that had developed around the management of hydraulic infrastructure was poorly suited to the more decentralized conditions that characterized settlement along the major rivers. Instead of the elaborate centralized authority required to coordinate vast irrigation networks, the new Khmer polities that emerged along the Mekong developed more flexible forms of organization that could adapt to the different challenges and opportunities of their riverine environment. The decisive moment in this long process of relocation came with the sack of Angkor by forces from the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya in 1431. This military defeat was not the fundamental cause of the empire's decline, which had been unfolding for more than a century, but it marked the symbolic end of Angkor as a major centre of political power. The royal court, already weakened by the environmental and economic crises we have traced, was forced to acknowledge that the old capital could no longer serve as the effective centre of a viable kingdom. The establishment of new capitals in the region, that would later become Phnom Penh, represented more than just a change of location. It embodied a fundamental shift in the relationship between political authority and environmental management. Instead of basing royal legitimacy on the control of elaborate hydraulic systems, the new Khmer kingdoms developed forms of authority that were better adapted to the more fluid conditions of riverine commerce and floodplain agriculture. The adaptation was not without its challenges and losses. The magnificent temple complexes of Angkor, with their intricate carvings and sophisticated architecture, could not be replicated in the new locations with the reduced resources and changed priorities of the post-collapse period. The artistic and intellectual traditions that had flourished under the patronage of the hydraulic empire were maintained only in simplified forms, adapted to the more modest scale of the successor kingdoms. But the move southward also brought opportunities for renewal and growth that had been impossible within the increasingly rigid constraints of the failing hydraulic system. The new kingdoms that emerged along the Mekong were able to take advantage of changing patterns of international trade, developing relationships with European merchants and Chinese trading networks that brought new sources of wealth and technological innovation. The greater flexibility of riverine settlement patterns allowed for more rapid adaptation to changing economic and political conditions than had been possible within the elaborate but fragile infrastructure of Angkor. The environmental advantages of the new locations became particularly apparent as the climate continued to fluctuate in ways that would have been devastating to the old hydraulic systems. The natural flood cycles of the Mekong, while variable from year to year, proved much more resilient to extreme weather events than the artificial reservoirs and canals that had been so vulnerable to both drought and flood. Communities along the river developed agricultural and settlement patterns that could accommodate these natural variations without the catastrophic failures that had characterized the later period at Angkor. Even as the political and economic systems that had sustained the hydraulic empire crumbled, and the centers of power shifted southward to new locations along the great rivers, important elements of Khmer civilization persisted in the abandoned heartland around Angkor. The great stone temples, too massive and too deeply rooted in the landscape to be moved or destroyed, remained as enduring witnesses to the achievements of earlier centuries. But these monuments did not simply stand empty, gathering dust and vines like the ruins of some completely vanished civilization. Instead, they continued to serve important spiritual and practical functions for the communities that remained in the region, adapting to new circumstances while preserving essential connections to the cultural traditions they embodied. The temples that had once been the centers of elaborate royal and priestly ceremonials gradually took on new roles that reflected the changed conditions of the post-collapse period. Angkor Wat, the greatest of these monuments, never entirely lost its sacred character, despite the departure of the royal court and the collapse of the institutional frameworks that had once supported its elaborate ritual functions. Local communities continued to regard the temple complex as a holy site, visiting it for religious observances that combined traditional practices with the newer Buddhist traditions that had gained prominence throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from the 15th through 18th centuries reveals patterns of modest but persistent occupation within the temple precincts. Small communities established temporary settlements in and around the great stone structures, using them as foundations for wooden buildings that have long since decayed but left traces of their existence in the form of post holes, hearth areas, and middens filled with the debris of daily life. These later inhabitants were not squatters or vandals, but people who maintained a genuine reverence for the sacred character of the sites, while adapting them to serve the practical needs of a simpler, more subsistence-oriented way of life. The moats and water features that surrounded the temple complexes proved particularly valuable to these later communities. The ancient reservoirs, while no longer part of a grand hydraulic system, continued to collect and store rainwater that could be used for drinking, cooking, and small-scale irrigation. The stone-lined channels that had once carried water according to the elaborate designs of hydraulic engineers were repurposed to serve the modest agricultural needs of rice farmers working small plots within and around the temple grounds. The artistic and architectural knowledge that had created the magnificent temples was not entirely lost, even though the social and economic conditions that had sustained the great building projects had disappeared. Local craftsmen continued to practice simplified versions of traditional carving and construction techniques, creating modest religious sculptures and architectural elements that echoed the styles and motifs of the classical period. While these later works lacked the scale and sophistication of their predecessors, they demonstrated the persistence of cultural knowledge and aesthetic traditions across the centuries of political and economic disruption. The agricultural knowledge that had made possible the intensive rice cultivation of the Golden Age also survived in adapted forms. Farmers in the Angkor region continued to practice sophisticated techniques of water management and crop rotation that derived from the hydraulic traditions of earlier centuries. While they could no longer maintain the elaborate canal networks and reservoir systems that had characterized the imperial period, they developed smaller-scale irrigation methods that incorporated principles learned from generations of experience with water management in tropical environments. The cultural memory of the Great Age of Angkor was preserved not only in the physical remains of temples and waterworks, but also in oral traditions that passed down stories of the achievements and the decline of the hydraulic empire. These narratives, transmitted from generation to generation by local communities, preserved essential elements of historical memory even when written records were scarce or absent. Folk tales and religious legends incorporated references to the god-kings who had commanded the waters and built the great temples, keeping alive a sense of connection to the magnificent past while explaining its transformation in terms that made sense within the changed circumstances of later centuries. The continuity of Khmer identity throughout this period of transformation demonstrates the resilience of cultural traditions that transcended the specific political and economic forms in which they had originally developed. The language, religious practices, agricultural techniques, and artistic traditions that had characterized Khmer civilization did not disappear with the collapse of the hydraulic empire, but rather adapted to new conditions while maintaining essential elements of continuity with the past. The Buddhist monasteries that gradually replaced the elaborate Hindu temple establishments as centers of religious and educational activity served as repositories for much of this cultural knowledge. Monks and scholars working in these simpler but more sustainable institutions preserved manuscripts, maintained schools, and continued the intellectual traditions that had flourished during the imperial period. While the scale and sophistication of these later achievements were modest, compared to the Golden Age of Angkor, they represented genuine cultural continuity rather than mere survival. The story of what happened to the jungle emperors of Angkor, with its intricate tale of hydraulic mastery and environmental vulnerability, speaks to us across the centuries with a relevance that grows more urgent with each passing year. As we sit in our own age of unprecedented urban complexity and environmental uncertainty, the lessons embedded in the rise and transformation of the Khmer Empire offer insights that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of medieval Cambodia. The same fundamental relationships between human ambition, technological achievement, and environmental limits that shaped the fate of Angkor continue to operate in our modern world, often in ways that we are only beginning to understand. Consider the parallels between the water-dependent civilization that flourished around the great temples of Angkor and the urban centres that dominate our contemporary landscape. Like the hydraulic cities of the Khmer Empire, our modern metropolitan areas depend upon vast and complex infrastructure systems that must function reliably to sustain millions of people in concentrations that would be impossible without technological intervention. The networks of pipes, pumps, treatment plants, and distribution systems that bring fresh water to modern cities are no less sophisticated than the canals and reservoirs of medieval Cambodia, and they are potentially no less vulnerable to the cascading failures that brought down the water empire of Angkor. The computer models that modern engineers use to analyze urban water systems reveal the same kinds of systemic vulnerabilities that archaeological science has identified in the hydraulic infrastructure of Angkor. When these complex networks are stressed beyond their design parameters, whether by extreme weather events, aging infrastructure, or unexpected demand fluctuations, they can experience the same kinds of cascading failures that overwhelmed the reservoir and canal systems of the Khmer Empire. A single point of failure in a critical component can trigger a domino effect that spreads throughout the entire system, leaving urban populations as vulnerable as the rice farmers of 14th century Cambodia when their irrigation networks collapsed. The climate challenges that contributed to the transformation of Angkor also echo in our contemporary experience of environmental change. The paleoclimatic records that reveal the increasing variability and extremes that stress the Khmer water systems find their modern equivalent in the mounting evidence for global climate disruption. The same kinds of oscillations between drought and flood that proved so destructive to the carefully engineered landscape around Angkor are becoming increasingly common in regions around the world where urban populations depend on infrastructure systems designed for more stable climatic conditions. The lesson is not that technological solutions to environmental challenges are inherently doomed to failure, but rather that they must be designed with a deeper understanding of their fundamental vulnerability to conditions that exceed their original parameters. The hydraulic engineers of Angkor created systems that were remarkably sophisticated and effective within the environmental envelope for which they were designed. Their failure came not from poor engineering, but from the encounter with environmental conditions that pushed the entire system beyond its adaptive capacity. Modern urban planners and engineers face similar challenges in designing infrastructure that can maintain reliability under increasingly variable and extreme conditions. The rigid, centralized systems that characterize the golden age of Angkor offer cautionary examples of approaches that can achieve remarkable efficiency under stable conditions but prove brittle when faced with unprecedented stresses. The alternative approach suggested by the Angkor experience is the development of more flexible, distributed, and adaptive infrastructure systems that can continue to function even when individual components fail or environmental conditions shift beyond historical norms. The social and institutional lessons of the Angkor story are equally relevant to our contemporary challenges. The hydraulic empire of the Khmer depended not only on sophisticated engineering, but also on stable social institutions and effective governance systems that could coordinate the maintenance and operation of complex infrastructure across vast distances and long time periods. When those institutional frameworks weakened due to changing religious practices, political fragmentation, and economic disruption, even the most sophisticated technological systems became impossible to sustain. Modern societies face similar challenges in maintaining the social and political cohesion necessary to support complex infrastructure systems over the long term. The temptation to defer maintenance, to prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term sustainability, and to assume that technological solutions can substitute for social cooperation are no less present today than they were in medieval Cambodia. The collapse of infrastructure systems often begins not with engineering failures, but with the breakdown of the institutional frameworks that make sustained collective action possible. Perhaps the most profound lesson that emerges from the story of Angkor is the importance of maintaining humility in the face of natural forces that remain ultimately beyond human control. The god kings of the Khmer Empire claimed divine authority over the waters that sustained their civilization, but their claims to mastery proved illusory when confronted with climatic changes that exceeded the adaptive capacity of even their most sophisticated systems. Our contemporary faith in technological solutions to environmental challenges may prove equally fragile if it is not tempered by recognition of the limits that natural systems impose on human ambition. The transformation of Angkor was not simply a collapse, but also an adaptation, a recognition that sustainable human communities must ultimately work with natural systems rather than attempting to dominate them completely. The survivors of the hydraulic empire found new ways of living, that were more modest in scale but also more resilient to environmental variability. Their experience suggests that true sustainability may require not just better technology, but also a fundamental reassessment of the relationship between human societies and the natural systems that sustain them. Our long journey through the rise and transformation of the jungle emperors of Angkor brings us back, at last, to where we began, to that vast, silent plain in the damp pre-dawn of the Cambodian jungle, where half-submerged stone causeways stretch into morning mist, and moss-covered temple walls rise barely above the encroaching forest. But now, having walked through centuries of human achievement and adaptation, having witnessed the patient accumulation of hydraulic mastery and its ultimate surrender to forces beyond human control, we can see this landscape with different eyes. The silence that surrounds you as you stand among these ancient stones is not the silence of death or abandonment, but rather the quiet that comes after a great conversation has ended, when the echoes of profound words still linger in the air. The jungle that presses against the temple walls is not an invader destroying the works of civilization, but rather a patient partner in the long dialogue between human ambition and natural process. The water that reflects broken spires in the early light carries within its quiet flow the memory of all the engineering marvels and agricultural abundance that once depended upon its seasonal gift. Each element of this landscape tells part of the story we have traced together. The causeway beneath your feet, built of stones fitted with mathematical precision, speaks of the technical mastery that made possible one of history's most sophisticated experiments in environmental management. The canal beside the path, now choked with lotus blossoms and water hyacinth, recalls the vast network of waterways that once carried life to hundreds of thousands of people across an engineered landscape nearly the size of a modern city. The temple towers that catch the first rays of sunlight embody the spiritual vision that transformed practical water management into a cosmic enterprise, seeking to align human society with the fundamental forces that govern monsoon and drought, abundance and scarcity. But the jungle that surrounds and gradually reclaims these monuments also tells an essential part of the story. The roots that slowly pry apart carefully fitted stones, the vines that drape ancient carvings in green curtains, the trees that rise from temple courtyards toward the sky, all participate in the larger conversation between human creativity and natural process that defines our relationship with the environment that sustains us. This is not destruction, but transformation. Not defeat, but adaptation. Not ending, but continuation in a different form. The scientists and scholars who study these ruins today are participants in the same fundamental human impulse that drove the original builders of Angkor: the desire to understand and work creatively with the natural systems that make life possible. The techniques they use to extract climate records from sediment cores, to decode the hydraulic principles embedded in ancient engineering works, to trace the subtle patterns of human occupation across centuries of change, represent the same intellectual curiosity and technical ingenuity that characterize the civilization they study. The knowledge they gain from this research contributes to our contemporary efforts to build more sustainable relationships between human society and environmental systems. The story of the jungle emperors resonates in our time not as a simple cautionary tale about the dangers of environmental overreach, but as a complex meditation on the relationship between human ambition and natural limits. The achievements of the Khmer Empire demonstrate the remarkable things that become possible when human intelligence is applied systematically to environmental challenges over extended periods of time. Their transformation reveals the importance of maintaining humility and adaptability in the face of natural systems that remain ultimately beyond our complete control. The physical remnants of Angkor continue to teach us about the dignity that can be found in impermanence. The temple complexes that survive from the golden age of the hydraulic empire are arguably more beautiful today, softened by time and embraced by jungle growth, than they were when they first rose from the engineering landscape that sustained them. The stones that once proclaimed the eternal authority of god-kings now speak more eloquently of the patience required to work with natural processes that operate on timescales that exceed individual human lifespans or even the duration of political systems. As you walk among these ruins in the gentle light of dawn, breathing the humid air that carries the scents of earth and growing things, listening to the quiet sounds of water moving through channels carved by both human hands and natural process, You participate in a moment of connection that spans centuries. The peace that settles over you here is not the peace of endings, but the peace of understanding continuity. The recognition that human achievements become truly lasting, not when they resist change, but when they contribute wisdom that can guide future adaptations to changing conditions. The jungle emperors of Angkor built magnificently, ruled wisely within the constraints of their time and knowledge, and ultimately yielded gracefully to forces larger than themselves. Their temples remain as testimony to what human beings can achieve when they combine technical skill with spiritual vision, individual creativity with collective effort, ambitious planning with respect for natural systems. Their transformation reminds us that even the greatest civilizations are temporary expressions of deeper and more enduring relationships between human consciousness and the natural world that sustains it. In the growing light of morning, as the mist begins to lift from the ancient stones and the first sounds of awakening birds echo through the temple corridors, you are invited to carry this understanding with you into whatever dreams may come. The story of Angkor becomes part of your own story, a reminder that we are all participants in the long human experiment of learning to live thoughtfully and humbly within the larger systems that make life possible. The wisdom embedded in these ancient stones, tempered by their patient surrender to time and jungle, offers guidance for the work of building more sustainable and resilient communities in our own time. The silence that surrounds you is not empty but full, pregnant with possibilities for renewal and adaptation that honor both human creativity and natural process.